welcome to our following discussion of the talk series about reconstructing cities and communities after URBICIDE in Ukraine. I have many hopes that today we will have such interesting discussion as the previous ones, and also I hope that many interesting thoughts will be found for today. My name is Maryana Sirko. I present National Art Museum of Ukraine, and today we will talk about another aspect of our great topic of post-war reconstruction. And today we will talk about the relation between post-war reconstruction and traumatic legacy of war. I think that this is also one of the very important points which we always should remember when we talk about any kind of rebuilding which is related to the urban landscape or about communication in communities. So I also hope that from this perspective, we will have some interesting questions in our discussions that could help us to think more and better about all these things. And now I invite Svitlana Shlipchenko to welcome everyone and also add some words to this talk.
Thank you all for that you were able to make it today and you are interested in our discussions and topic. I represent Urban Studies Center in Kiev, which is a partner institution of the National Art Museum, and who also initiated this series of the discussions, which are really important for us. And we have been thinking whether it's too early to start, but I think it's time to start thinking, and it's time to start reflecting, and time to start learning lessons from other people's experience. We will see whether could be universal lessons, or are they universal remedies, or they're not, or each case is a single one. And I'm really glad and happy to introduce Gruia Badescu, who is an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow and a Zukunftskolleg Research Fellow at the University of Konstanz. His research examines how societies deal with difficult paths through special practices, including critical approaches and memory work. One focus of his research is urban post-war reconstruction, and particularly in the former Yugoslavia and the Middle East. And I hope Gruia will bring up these examples. And so welcome you all. Let's start.
Well, thank you very much, Svitlana, and thank you very much, Maryana, and thank you all for taking part today. So I'm very grateful for the invitation and to be able to take part in the dialogue with people in Ukraine and beyond. And so I was asked to address this issue of traumatic legacies of war. And because sadly I was not able to join the other meetings because of our institute having this exactly the same time our weekly seminar, I was able just to have a sneak preview. So what I will do also I will try not to replicate the same examples, and also discussing URBICIDE. Also, I see we have here very important experts on this. So what I will do is I will take you on in a few directions in a few places, and address a lot of questions as well as some insights. And maybe just as a sneak preview to where we're going, I would argue that we have to understand each context in its own specificity rather than actually looking for golden answers. But what we do by looking at other places is actually we're able to see what can go wrong. So it's always good to listen to situations from other places. So I will share my my screen now. Okay, and let me know also if you can hear me well. Okay. Oops. So first I thought of actually of just telling you how I got interested in this particular topic and why does it matter to me as it matters to many of you. So I grew up in the neighboring country of Ukraine, in the south, in a country that actually, I guess, not many people in Ukraine have much knowledge as it happened on the other side of the border. But now actually one of the impacts of this terrible war is also that there are many Ukrainians now in Romania, in Bucharest, and there are dialogues that start taking place, which is actually the bridges that are happening even in these very difficult times. But I grew up in a country that in the 1980s saw large destructions of cities. So that was part of Nicolae Ceausescu's plan to transform cities into proper socialist cities, as he described. So in the 1980s, about 20 urban centers were completely demolished, including a third of the city of Bucharest, and then new cities were rebuilt. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s, hearing a lot of stories about pain, about demolitions, about displacement, people using the word trauma, people talking a lot about losing their home and then being rehoused in other places. That was not a war situation. This was during peace, albeit in a dictatorship. But this is something that was really important in how I related to this idea of destruction. This is something that an idea of losing home was somehow obsessive for all of us who had family who went through this. So somehow when I was 18 and I went to Warsaw for the first time, and I saw the reconstruction of its old center in a completely different context, the one of rebuilding what Hitler wanted to destroy in order to annihilate the whole being of the Poles, or the whole, let's say, the whole heritage of a people who actually resisted. They had, there are two uprisings, the Jewish and the broader uprising in Warsaw. Hitler reacted by ordering demolition and the construction of a small German town of settlers. But for me, this idea of rebuilding, looking at simply paintings of the past, was very powerful. And then I started asking myself questions. What does it mean actually to rebuild? And what does it mean when, for instance, in Germany, the neighboring country, the one that actually inflicted the aggression and the destruction, most cities also ended up being destroyed. So then I got somehow drawn into the German questions of dealing with the past, and particularly Theodor Adorno as a figure who said to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. Then I wondered, what about architecture? What about urban planning? But what do you mean? What does it mean to rebuild after horrible situations such as the Holocaust or the Second World War in general? So this is how I got to this research, which was first my dissertation at the University of Cambridge, and then now the topic of the forthcoming book, in which I bring together more situations. So how do we relate the built environment being rebuilt with this process of dealing with the past? Because when we rebuild, we have so many concerns. There's housing, there's infrastructure, there's the form. Architects think about form a lot, but what, if at all, there's a need to talk about dealing or coming to terms with a difficult past, with a traumatic past. So if just in case you're not familiar with this particular concept coming from the German, Vergangenheitsbewältigung is a way of mastering the past, in which countries, after being in a dictatorship or after a war, they are trying to deal with the negative presence of the past in society. And of course, extreme example, and Adorno was talking and calling for Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit, or working through the past that will be somehow not just mastering and not just telling victorious stories or victimhood stories about the past, but actually dealing with responsibility and guilt. And this is something very specific to Germany, but there are also other countries that are perpetrators. And we see now, this is not a topic, this is not a question that we discuss now in connection with Ukraine. Ukraine is in a completely different situation in which you have an aggressor destroying its cities, its infrastructure, its territory. But what does it mean to deal with the past in that specific case when you are being aggressed? So going back to the German case, it's interesting how in the 1960s there were a couple of psychologists, Alexander Mitscherlich and Margarete Mitscherlich, who wrote this book, The Inability to Mourn. And they were arguing that Germany was so obsessed of rebuilding its cities, rebuilding its economy, that for 20 years, people did not actually engage with their own feelings of sadness, of trauma, either by being bombed or even some by actually losing Hitler. So this idea of inability to mourn showed that reconstruction can sometimes just mask a society that cannot really heal. And again, Germany is an extreme example, and it's a very different situation. But what does it mean when actually we rebuild without engaging with forms of trauma? And so somehow, when we talk about post-catastrophic cities, or post-catastrophic, as in this case, what we see today in Ukraine is not only cities, they're towns, they're villages, they're different spaces. It's very important to ask questions: what does destruction mean for residents? But also, what does it mean when you rebuild after this war? Is it just a way of doing another form of urban development? Is it the same way as if you rebuild after an earthquake? And I will argue that not. That what is very important is to really look at dealing with the past and this very specific importance of war and war violence. So trauma. This is a topic that it's so important, so discussed in psychology and not only. And when we talk to people going through trauma right now, I don't think it's, I don't want to dwell on trauma today. I want to actually dwell on hope and on what reconstruction can mean. But I just wanted to mention the work of psychiatrist Mindy Fulilov, who wrote in the early 2000s about root shock. And what happens when people lose their house, their homes, their houses, their cities? They have to flee. And one thing that I want to emphasize today is not only destruction, but also displacement, and how reconstruction has to engage with this issue of displacement and return of people who are now either in other parts of Ukraine or in other parts of Europe or the world. Because it's not only about the built environment, it's also about how do we connect with the communities who lost homes and who are longing sometimes from far away. So another important thing to address is also, of course, memory. And memory, we see memory as the way that individuals, but also as social groups, as Al-Baks was writing 100 years ago, social groups can remember. It can remember a traumatic event such as a war. And the urban space reconfiguration is also a reconfiguration of memory. So somehow urban space is a mirror of memory, but we can talk more about this. I didn't want to go into much into this conceptual issues, but going more into into the how are we rebuilding and how do we connect the two processes. And when we are talking about reconstruction and memory, we have to think of actors. And on the one hand, we're dealing with urban space itself as an arena, architecture, ruins, urban space, the way we imagine their cities, but also the way that architecture is just an allegory of different political projects. But then also we look at actors as institutions or human actors, states, and how they rebuild. But at the local level, how do we have different local authorities? How we have architects, planners who modify space, and then really engage with also questions of dealing with the past. And of course, very important, communities and their collective memory. So these are actors that will appear throughout today's discussion. But I just wanted to bring them before we talk about also the issue of situations. So in the last century, we saw a transformation of war. Wars are very different. When we talk about rebuilding cities in former Yugoslavia or in Lebanon or Yemen or today's Ukraine, we're dealing with very different types of warfare. So we have to take that into consideration, not only in the way that destruction is happening, but also the actors that took part. And somehow it's interesting how the 20th century came back through the way that Putin just unilaterally invaded a country in a very somehow earlier 20th century way. After you had so many people writing about the new wars, about the change of warfare, we have this basically invasion happening. And what's here to have in mind is that after the war, there will be in every society, there's a discussion of who is the perpetrator, who is the victim, and reconstructions are connected with this. So what am I going to do now in the remainder of the time? First, very briefly, what does it mean to think reconstruction at wartime? And so because reconstruction begins now during war. Then second, looking at three approaches on rebuilding and on memory. So how do we do when we engage fully with memory and we're kind of obsessed with memory? Then when you want to erase the war and you want to rebuild everything the way it was, and then the one that dominated the 20th century, you use reconstruction to as an opportunity. But then in the third part, I want to dwell on the issue of emplacement, and that's about dealing with people who lost homes and they return. In the interest of time, I might jump over some things as I realize that I don't want to talk too much. So basically, the first very important aspect is that Svitlana mentioned earlier on that is it the right time to talk about reconstruction now? And all that we see in previous situations that yes, reconstruction planning kind of always starts from the wartime. And basically, if you look from the Second World War to even the early months of the siege of Sarajevo, to Beirut. In Beirut, for instance, where you had a civil war in Lebanon from 1975 to 1990, people were organizing symposia in the early 80s, in which they were discussing the vision for rebuilding. In that case, the war took a long time, which everyone hopes is not going to be the case now. But what's important is that people are planning, and those ideas often generate projects that actually do get realized in the afterwards. Sometimes it's a bit perverse. Like for instance, one should know that many post-war reconstruction projects in Germany were actually done by Nazi authorities in during the early 40s, and then they were put into practice after. But the fact of the matter is that reconstruction thinking starts day one. So it's very important that you are doing this, this discussion at the moment and talking about other places and thinking about what makes sense for the Ukrainian context and how to move forward. And also that means that reconstruction planning in dark times is also a form of resilience and hope. So in Sarajevo, today I spend a lot of time, as many of the people actually who are taking part in this project, architects, for instance, I think that this, as many people in society, they wanted to make sense. I mean, they wanted to go through the horrible siege of 3 years that took control that city by doing things in the guise of normality. For architects, that meant they would go to the architecture faculty, for instance, they will traverse alleys of snipers, and they will arrive there and they will talk about reconstruction, even in as early as 1992. And so, for instance, the war architecture project was done by people working together during the war, talking about destruction, but also talking about reconstruction. If you look at Syria, if you look at Homs, for instance, so Syria has been ravaged by a civil war since 2011. And for instance, in Homs, in Aleppo, in other places, you have people who have been rebuilding without knowing what's going to happen next. But it's part of keeping yourself sane and also of keeping the hope that actually you rebuild. So people, at least in Syria now, we see a kind of end of violence. But what's important is to see that throughout that decade of war, people rebuilt, and that's a way of working through the everyday realities of violence, and it's a way of actually engaging actively with the pain of destruction. But now, once the war is over, what do we make of it? So, in the interest of time, I think I will go a bit quicker than I wanted on this particular thing. But at the end of war, or even during the war, there are ideas that you have to preserve some ruined memorials, like for instance, in the case of France, in Spain, Franco even made a whole village to be a memorial for the violence of the other side in this case. And the point is that the power of the ruin is intended to keep the memory of the horrors of war. So how to tell the future generations never again, not to repeat that. And this happens also with in cities where you have memorials, ruin memorials. And I'm aware that you actually discussed in a couple of weeks ago the case of Belgrade, and this is actually something that I wrote extensively about, but I'm not going to develop exactly because you heard already about it. But what's interesting is that even decades after the NATO bombing of 1999, you still have ruins in the center of the city. And while you have explanations related to different bureaucratic processes, many will point out that this is somehow a memorial of the NATO bombing, to remind both residents but also visitors about what NATO did in the capital of Yugoslavia, then Yugoslavia. And so what's important is to situate this role of a memorial in a place that was not as much destroyed as other cities, because there were about 70 buildings that were destroyed in the city. They were targeted in this what NATO calls a strategic high-tech operation. And so in this case, ruins are speaking as a testimony for what happened. In the case of Sarajevo, you probably remember, if you participated a few weeks ago, there was the discussion on Lebow's Woods, this American architect who came at the end of the war and suggested that basically the city cannot just go back to the way it was. The city should have a mark of the violence of this 3-year siege, which the city was shot at. So he suggested this form of radical reconstruction in which you don't keep the whole city as ruins, but you would rebuild parts of the city, parts of buildings to be functional, and then other parts will be scabs, as he called them. So scars that become scabs, and this way people would react. Would always live with the memory of war. Well, the reaction in the city of Sarajevo, and the people I talked to throughout the years, was full rejection of this, because people did not want to be always re-traumatized somehow by seeing these elements. People, as Miha Cengic, for instance, said, they just wanted their city back. They wanted to remove this dark memory of 3 years of destruction and killings. So in this case, while in the case of Belgrade, ruins are somehow important to remind of what is narrated as the aggression of NATO. In the case of Sarajevo, ruins were removed in order to move on and to heal. While there was one initiative to keep a memorial, a newspaper of people who went again every day to work during the war, the Oslobođenje newspaper, but eventually that was bought and built up like the way you see it here. Anyway, the one question about this issue of memorialization is also how do we mark it? And one case that you already discussed in this series was the case of the Vijećnica, the city hall, which was rebuilt, and you discussed already how it was rebuilt. But one thing I wanted to point out is that on the rebuilt Vijećnica, you still have this plaque which announced that, when I read quote, Serbian criminals have burned this National University Library. And so there's a discussion happening in memory circles, let's say, in Sarajevo about do we need such a plaque? Do we need to actually to indicate the ethnicity of those who did it? How does it assist now, decades after the end of war, the relatively tense relationship between the populations of Bosnia and Herzegovina? So this is something that one needs to have in mind also. Now it's very hard to think during the war about this particular topic when the aggressor is very clear. But this idea of how do you remind this? Can you just mention that it was destroyed, or you have to mention the aggressor? And this is something that we can discuss further in the discussion. Full reconstruction as repair. Again, for the interest of time, I will just mention that the case of Warsaw that I already mentioned was an exception to what was seen at the time of the conservation doctrine. So basically, in the 20th century, the idea of rebuilding was seen as inauthentic and a forgery. But in this case, Jan Zahvatovich, the head of historic preservation, argued that the question of falsification is a subtle one, but our national pride obliges us to rebuild. So it's so this is what triggered actually the reconstruction of Warsaw, which actually received in the 1980s already UNESCO World Heritage for this particular approach that changed the paradigm of actually rebuilding. Rebuilding, of course, means erasing the memory of war, but you can remind in other ways. Okay, I will jump over this, but I will come back into the discussion. I was just looking at time. But I want to go into this idea of reconstruction as opportunity. So in this case, this is maybe the most common approach, in which at the end of the war, in different wars, particularly in the historical moment of the Second World War, particularly architects and planners said, well, if this is destroyed, why don't we take advantage and use it as an opportunity to build better cities? So build better cities, if we're looking at this historic moment of the 1940s and 50s, that came after a lot of disgruntlement with the way that particularly 19th century industrial cities were, and they were described as overcrowded and uncomfortable. And so the new plans wanted to bring this idea of modernity and hope for a bright new future. This is based on this idea of modernity embodied, for instance, by the Siam and the Athens Charter. But the resulting projects, what was very interesting at the time, were never consulted in impact with the local population. There's some exceptions, and what resulted is something that was seen in the German context, for instance, as a second destruction. So reconstruction actually many times, instead of actually contributing to better living environments according to the people, they implemented ideas of modernity, such as, for instance, the car-centered city at the time, which were seen as a deliberate provocation, a second destruction. So in this case, we see that even still standing buildings were removed, and then this traffic circle was built. And so many places in Europe were reshaped in ways that lost in the view of residents a sense of place. So this idea of the sense of place is something that is very important to consider. How do people feel about their neighborhoods, their cities? And so somehow when you just leave architects and planners who were at that time embodying a particular way of seeing things, like modernity, then it ends up being described by people as being unfriendly environments that are not really for people. And so that also triggered, in the case of Germany, but not only, is that today there are reconstructions, like many decades after, of, for instance, old style centers. So after the Second World War, as Aleida Asman says, we're in a time of rebuilding for the future. Now we're also in a time of reconstruction of a new past. So this is an architecture from the archive, in order to kind of cater to these people who would like a more human scale, but also to recover the past. Yet that's also problematic on a number of levels, and we can talk about that too. What does that mean to actually feel this particular nostalgia? So these are, for instance, the new old town of Frankfurt. And then when you're doing reconstruction with this idea of new in mind, the question is also, what do you erase? So taking it to Sarajevo, in Sarajevo, many buildings that were completely reshaped come from a particular history. For instance, this is the Sarajka department store built in socialist Yugoslavia and replaced by a Saudi Saudi-funded Bedait center. Maybe more telling is this example of Hotel Europe. Hotel Europe is a very important landmark of Sarajevo that was built in the 19th century, and then in the 1970s received a new wing, a functionalist wing. And this is the model for its reconstruction. This is how it looked when it was destroyed. And the main architect, Sead Golos, was very important in rebuilding, because he died of COVID a few years ago. He was one of the main figures of rebuilding, and quite contested by other parts of the architecture profession. But basically, what he told me is that he decided to rebuild this because it's of course, this is the Habsburg, when actually it's built by before the Habsburg. But anyway, it's the Central European heritage of Sarajevo, while the other one is part of Yugoslavia. So he said a while ago, Zagreb has a long tradition, and then was reborn after the recent war. Yugoslavia was a parenthesis, was a break in the evolution of Bosnian architecture. So what does it mean when you erase entire periods of time as Yugoslavia associated with modernism? This is actually a very important question to be had in the discussion on Ukraine. What happens when many of the targets are actually Soviet era built buildings? So this is an important discussion to be had in the country. There are already fantastic Ukrainian scholars who have worked on the Soviet modernism in the last few decades, talking about the need for preservation. But this is a debate that has to take place in the country to see to what extent reconstruction of these buildings, to what extent are these forms meaningful for people? What do they represent? To what extent does the war reshape the history of the Soviet Union in Ukraine? These are tough questions, but something to be discussed. Of course, it's very different to talk about Yugoslavia than talk about the Soviet Union. I'm not making the direct parallel, but it's important to think of what erasure means and amnesia. And finally, with this, I wanted to talk about the participatory approach in Reconstruction. So we hear a lot about Reconstruction being participatory in the last few decades. That even the World Bank is funding that. But also when we deal with the past, I argue it should be participatory. So we have to engage with the voice and the narrative of different groups when we do Reconstruction. And that's connected with what's called transitional justice. So transitional justice is this body of work on how do we deal with difficult pasts. It's connected with post-war, but also post-dictatorship transformation. And there's something called restorative transitional justice, in which you give voice. You give voice to different groups, and it's a societal debate about this. So to give one example, in the case of Belgrade, the radio television of Serbia was bombed in 1999, and 16 people were caught in the building working. They were caught because their director ordered them to stay, despite knowing that NATO will bomb. The families of victims have argued that was a ploy of the Milosevic government to basically have a human sacrifice and to talk about how bad NATO was. And for many years, this remained ruin until the families of the victims actually initiated a process with the city planning office of Belgrade. And this was a participatory project in which the direct stakeholders took part, and they participated into making the design brief and into voting for the winner. And so this is about embodying also the complications of this memory of the event. Who is guilty? Who is the victim here? And and I can talk more about this topic of some articles that I wrote. So we can talk about this if you want more. But in the way of engaging with them, these approaches is also to the use of irony and humor. And for instance, thanking the international community in Sarajevo for just sending spam canned beef. It's interesting how Bosnians are looking at today at the situation in Ukraine, and some of them would say Europe is way more solidary with Ukraine now than it was with us. It's an interesting statement, and there are different discussions about that. But what's important is that some artists use that frustration to express that artistically. And now finally, in the final part, I wanted to talk about Reconstruction as emplacement. But maybe I'm thinking, because I talked for a while, and this is a very important topic, but I might take 10 more minutes. So maybe I'm thinking if I will ask if you think that I should go until the end, or we can have already some reflections from the public. What do you think? What are your thoughts? Should I finish, or should
I think you can go to the end and then reflections.
Sorry?
I think you can go to the end and then reflections, because I think it's too captive and interesting.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. So then I want to shift to something very different. The issue of people who, for whom are we rebuilding? Because a lot of the discussions of Reconstruction assume that we are rebuilding either the way it was or a new project, but for whom? Because an important thing that's been happening in Ukraine is how people have millions of people have been relocated either to other parts of Ukraine or neighboring countries or beyond. So what does that mean for reconstruction? What does that mean for the process of healing after this? So the same Mindy Fulilov, who I mentioned earlier, she said that displacement is the problem that the 21st century must solve, because there's so much displacement happening for many different reasons. And in this case, displacement is also should be a focus of reconstruction. First, to give some lessons, let's say some lessons learned from the situation in the former Yugoslavia. In the former Yugoslavia, there were millions of people who went around, millions of refugees and internally displaced people, and some things that happened. But on the one hand, that created a lot of informal construction, a lot of, as they were called in legal jargon, they're illegal buildings. So basically, a lot of people go where they find that it'll be more peaceful for them, where they feel safe. So, for instance, in Belgrade, many Serb refugees from Croatia and Bosnia went and built informal housing. And then the state had to deal with that at the end of the war. There were 150,000 so-called illegal buildings, and what they did, they just legalized them. But these neighborhoods did not have amenities, electricity, etc. They all had to be done after. So this is something that happens. Displacement is also connected with this. So we can see here a map of Belgrade, how basically the surface, the inhabited surface of Belgrade changed after the wars from Yugoslavia. The red is informal housing. You can see the impact on the city, and this is something that is usually not discussed, and we don't think of Europe with this issue of informality. But look, this is another result of war, and we have to think about it now in Ukraine. I'm not saying that this is happening. I don't know what's happening on the ground, but people need houses, and people might build a house in the field if they don't have. Of course, when we talk about refugees and displaced people, a lot of people think of camps. But the reality in the world is that majority of people today, displaced people or refugees, live in cities. They live in cities of their country, or they live in cities elsewhere. So just 10 years ago, you can see this. So the idea of displacement is an urban one. So we have to adapt to urban displacement. And what we see in different environments, for instance, what is the impact of having a country like Lebanon of 4 million people, having 2 million Syrian refugees? Refugees come and live in cities in like Beirut, and they become city makers. They reshape urban space. They bring a form of vitality. They also there are tensions between groups that we have to think about. But one thing is important: refugees reshape both the places they are in abroad, but also if we think of Lviv or Kiev, you have people coming from east or south who are reshaping those cities. And something that I wanted to now emphasize is that on the one hand, this is seen as, we can see this optimistic way, the way that Germany, for instance, portrayed itself after 2015 with the Syrian refugees, the idea of making Heimat Germany a rival country. But then we can also see the tensions that emerge. So I want to go now back to the former Yugoslavia. So at the end of the wars, you have a situation of return, and in the peace agreement in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there's a Dayton peace agreement, and there's Annex 7, which mentions that because the war also included ethnic cleansing, people had to flee. For instance, Bosnian Muslims fled East Bosnia. They went elsewhere. The Dayton Peace Agreement gave them the right to their home, to going back to their home. In international precedent, usually people had the right to come back to their country. In this case, it was specifically mentioned to go back to their town or to their home. And this right was also as a way of guilt of the international community for not intervening, let's say, earlier enough, and to provide an antidote to ethnic cleansing. But what does that mean? It means that somehow that international community was convinced of the myth of home. And Roger Zetter, who's an expert at Oxford, coined this term, saying that we think that people always want to return home. And of course, we all have a home, we all have memories of a home. But what happens when, what does home mean? So in 2014, I started working with the Center for Displaced People in Sarajevo. And I worked this on the side from my PhD as a volunteer and working with a lot of people who were displaced in the last decades. And through the years, I saw that many of them were mentioning, many of them who were living in Sarajevo, but they were born in other communities in other parts of Bosnia, Herzegovina, or they were refugees in Germany and returned, and they now live in the city. And many of them will tell you that home is about social networks. It's not bound to the building of a house. It's about your livelihood. Also, where you have most friends. And somehow people do not root in place; they root in each other. So what happens is that if one looks at what experience of Bosnia and other places, is that people, even if they have nostalgia for their lost home, they will look for cool ground. Cool ground means a place where it's safe, a place that can offer opportunities for employment, for work. So people might want to go back to their place in South or East Ukraine, let's say, but they might be worried that there's no more economy there. But also, in the post-Soviet, post-socialist transformation, this is a problem all over Central Eastern Europe. But what does it mean when you think that your house has been destroyed, but maybe your livelihood? Do you want to return? So according to this cool ground, let's say paradigm, people will rather be in a place where they have an opportunity. This can be abroad, but many Ukrainians, most Ukrainians I met here in Germany, they want to return. But maybe they will not return to their town. Maybe they will return to Kyiv or Lviv or big cities or Kharkiv that have opportunities. So that's something to consider. And so emplacement, this process of emplacement is a way of dealing with this with trauma, into investing places with significance, and you re-embed social relations that were destroyed, distanciated, disembedded. So people make homes in different places. And so Steph Janssen, who's a marvelous anthropologist whose work I really admire, he once said that rather reducing home retrospectively to a remembered site of belonging, we should also analyze it prospectively as a socially constituted object of belonging. So homes are not only about memories, but also about the future. And if you look at, for instance, my work with the Bosnian displaced people, younger people would rather stay in a big city, while older people would rather go and confront perhaps hostile neighbors sometimes and return to smaller places. But what happens is that the presence of these displaced people in the city, or in the case of Sarajevo, on the hills of the city, led to a lot of animosity. So for many people in the from Sarajevo, they will describe this as a uglification of the city through this informal housing built on the hills around the city. And they would talk about an invasion this time of people from other parts that don't understand Sarajevo, they will claim. And it's somehow a form of separation and a tension between these groups, even decades after the end. So so basically, this is something to have in mind of how do we plan, first of all, how do we plan these cities now? Start thinking about a bigger Lviv and a bigger Kyiv already, because these cities have opportunities, and planning should mean also be flexible and think about the possibility that the cities will be maybe even double at the end of the war. So what does that mean? And planners should start thinking about that this situation of informal housing at the outskirts that doesn't happen. So this is one thought. And the second one is, how do you build the bridges between people so that people, particularly in a country like Ukraine, that has very different regions with very different historical legacies, self-identifications, it's forms of local pride. So how do you bridge that so that people from the West do not look down in a way or another to people from the East? How do you make that? So the discussion on reconstruction should be participatory, but should also include these different voices, because otherwise things can become tense and exclusions can occur, like it happened in Bosnia, where people I was interviewing were telling me how they feel discriminated against for not coming from not being born there, even if there's the same religion, the same ethnicity, and the same victim group as the people in Sarajevo who live there today. So then, 3 concluding thoughts. On the one hand, taking you to to Beirut, the city that, this is the a day before Putin invaded on the 24th of February. I was in Beirut. I was there. It's a place that went through a lot of difficult times in the last decades, but also particularly the last 2 years. There was also the explosion, and I just wanted to focus that despite having reconstruction happening all over on the explosion that destroyed a lot of the city, this graffiti is something that we should think about. Our space is destroyed, but we are not, said the people after the explosion. People had resilience. But now, in a country that's under multiple crises, people say our space is restored, but we are not. So again, the main point here is that reconstruction and also societal dealing with the past, societal working to heal has to be hand in hand, because we just don't want back shiny cities or projects for the future. We need a community that's being restored. And that's why we have to think about emplacement, about consultation, about participation, about ways of engaging with these different communities. Second point is that reconstruction is different than business as usual. So whoever is working on this, be it architects, be it authorities, be it communities, they should think of the ethics of architectural intervention. So what are the possibilities for architecture, for instance, to engage with displacement, with reconstruction, to memory, while functioning in a very complicated landscape of real estate, of money, of political economy, of there are going to be a lot of actors coming from different international organizations, from institutions, from countries who will pump money in Ukraine. And the question is, how do you deal with that so that somehow reconstruction is the one done by the people, by the local actors, by actually talking about a social contract and a vision, rather than having forms of erasure or yes. And finally, the context matters. To go back to this example, remember how a ruin can traumatize, while a ruin can also be a symbol of victimhood in a very different context. So this is why the debate in Ukraine is not only about reconstruction, but it's also about the position of the country. What is the story told nationally? What is the story told regionally? Because this is the question I want to end with. After all this, how different is actually the way we're going to the way that Ukrainians will rebuild Kyiv, Mykolaiv, and Luhansk different? How do we take into consideration difference regionally? These are just three cities, but we can talk about all of them. To what extent does it matter what regional trajectory, what regional legacy, what heritage, but also the type of war? It's very different to talk about what we saw as the destruction now in 2022 in comparison with these areas that have been seeing war for a longer time and have been seeing all these other forms of paramilitaries and declaration of Syria independence. How different is the situation there, and what kind of discussion has taken place there at the end of the war, or even now? So these are just a few questions to spark a discussion. And of course, for the interest of time, I can go into many different directions, but I hope it's enough to start the conversation. So thank you very much for your attention. Oops.
Thank you so much, Gruia. It was extremely interesting presentation and very dynamic, and perhaps somebody has questions. Would have questions.
Maybe I can also go back to ask, what do you think about this? Is there a difference on the project of rebuilding rebuilding in different parts of Ukraine?
I think you raised very important questions, about this reconstruction as a story told nationally and regionally, and it's important. I think it's important for Ukraine. We can build on, we can theorize on it, but I've been thinking, well, once you have been talking, I've been thinking how to implement it or how to approach it, how to do it, because it's one thing, you know, when you talk to, when you discuss it with other people who understand you, and another thing, once you try to do something with the municipality, with activists, and in the city, and we do now have conflicts in Kyiv with the activists and municipality. And for example, the destroyed building of the turn of the 20th century, it was destroyed by the Iranian drone. And we have the petition signed by many people to restore the building, and our municipality said that it's not restorable. So with such conflicts, you know, between the past, because the past is important for the city. And on the other hand, you have been also talking about, you know, the homogeneous, for example, almost, I wouldn't say that in Lviv the community is homogeneous, but, you know, they have certain traditions, certain image of the city. And people are incoming people bring along their traditions, their visions, their way of life, and it will challenge their status quo. How can we deal with it? What do you think?
Yes, I mean, as far, it's interesting. Also, my knowledge of Ukraine is based on not only reading throughout the years, but also being in very different parts. So I think I was mentioning to you another time, being in Lviv, in Dnipro, in Kyiv, in Chernivtsi, every city is different. It's a country that's striking through this very particularly interesting cities, which are different from one another. And Lviv is a very proud city, and on the one hand, it's a bastion of national identity. But it's going to be interesting. What are possible clashes about that particular way of seeing Ukrainian national identity from other Ukrainians coming from other parts of the country? So I'm not sure what the dynamics are at the moment in Lviv, and I think maybe Yaroslava, I think you are from Lviv, if I remember correctly. I might be very wrong. I see you have a hand, Yaroslava.
Yaroslava.
Yeah.
Are you?
Hello, I am not from Lviv. I am from Kyiv.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. But I'm from Ukraine. And first of all, it's just my point, but I think it's time when Ukrainians unite. It's no such a different like 10 years ago between West and East. And when I read the news, it's news called RBK Ukraine, they sometimes write about interviews, for example, about think Ukrainian, about trust Ukrainian, about soldier, vision Ukrainian, about their future, and other things. And it's more simple, more not so different result in different part of Ukraine and different part of Ukraine. Sorry. So I think it's first time that Ukrainians are united. It's interesting, but it deals Ukrainian language too. And second, I have a proposal. Maybe it's need to do some interviews with Ukrainian people, for example, about memory and working with memory. For example, I have a friend, and her house destroyed by a Russian soldier, and it's not only destroyed; it's about they was there a long time, and she just feel that it's ugly to her, maybe to return to this apartment. Is this reason? For example, maybe it will be interesting interviews about how Ukrainians think about it, planning return to their apartments or not, if they have the situation, or if they have some traumatic experience about cities, about destroying cities, about brutal other things. And another example, in our building, Shevchenko National University of Science of Ukraine, we have a hole in the window from bullet. It's since revolution on dignity, and we just let this window with hole, but maybe it's different between it's seems like some heroic story, not like victim. You're not association this whole as victim. Your association this window about heroic. So maybe it's different between this option. So I think it might be.
Thank you, Yaroslava. And I suggest that people can just speak whenever. I mean, and we just reply to each other, so we have a group dynamic.
Yeah.
Yes.
And thank you for this interesting conversation.
I thank all of you for being here and for discussing.
Maybe someone else want to ask some questions. We still have a little time to discuss some thoughts. So,
but not only a need for questions, you can just react, because also there.
Yeah, of course, some reflections also will be very.
Yeah, mine is not a question, but first of all, I would like to thank Gruia for being here, for accepting our invitation. With Gruia, we are in conversation about this problem since big time. So we share a common approach, and I'm really happy that we have involved him in this project. Just a couple of questions, observation, reaction, or whatever he wants. This idea of wartime, conflict time reconstruction is very interesting. It's very interesting because somehow changes everything in the formulation of the problem, let's say. You know my book. I share with you this idea that reconstructing is reconstructing a memory, first of all. But what if we start thinking about reconstruction? It's something that already emerged with Alexander Stanisic and another. What if we start thinking about reconstruction as an act of resilience rather than an act of ideological restoration, as it usually is. And I'm very happy that this is something that is coming up again and again in these days, in these weeks, in these talks. Also next week, I know that Maria Rosaria Vitale will talk of the same problem of the reconstruction during the war. And I remember that some years ago, I participated in the organization of a conference in Syracuse about the same topic, about urbicide and post-urbicide, mostly reconstruction. And there were these architects from Syria. They were discussing about this emergence architecture, emergence reconstruction. Emergence is a word with many connotations, not always positive, as we know, because from the semantics of emergence, many other implication derives, like implication affecting the political dimension and so on. But still, something that it's very interesting to discuss. I was thinking about yes, this is wartime, because I agree with you. I completely agree with you that the reaction that you registered from fellow Sarajevians when they were elicited in front of the pictures now of the Livius Woods proposals for reconstruction. I remember the same reactions, and also in Mostar. No, there was a moment in Mostar in which the bridge, some projects, some plans for the bridge were proposed, like futuristic, modernistic plexiglass projects for the bridge, and everybody was like shocked by this. And so I was thinking about this sentence you quoted. You know, the reconstruction of Warsaw was let's say an unavoidable exception, because an unavoidable exception to the principles of architectonic restoration. So we accepted the falsification because maybe, I don't know, there is an architect that I respect very much that says that if we reconstruct immediately after, it's not reconstruction, it's maintenance. Something like that. And so maybe it's true somehow. I also believe, but I'm sure that there isn't a way to exactly rebuild what's lost, because this is also an ideological position. But still, I think that this point is it's crucial, and something that we discussed a lot with Alexander, especially this idea of a non-ideological reconstruction, which is instead an act of resilience, of response to the atrocity of war. So thank you for bringing this up, Gruia. I think it's very important.
Yes, thank you very much, Francesco, for all this. So basically, indeed, reconstruction is an act of resilience. But I would say, actually, in response, that even if there's not a political intentionality, reconstruction have a political implication. So even if we want to be neutral, we want to have reconstruction as a resilience, we have to think of the impact, because when you rebuild. When you can erase some layers, willingly or unwillingly, what's important is that socialist Yugoslavia, for instance, disappears from the center of Sarajevo. Either that someone says that they want it to disappear, or that it just happens. So what we think about the implications of that. And then, yeah, with this emergency reconstruction, and I was talking a lot with Syrian, there's a Syrian diaspora who was very active in the UK, where I was more familiar with them, in actually talking about reconstruction, who communicate with people in Syria, with from NGOs to architects, to different communities who have been rebuilding as resilience. So that's indeed it's quite a interesting take. Also, it's a very different durée of the war. But going to this exception of war, so it was an exception because at the time, conservationists were dominated by this paradigm of we are not supposed to rebuild because that's a forgery. This is this is something that most of the 20th century was dominated. That was a reaction to the 19th century, when you had people like Viollet-le-Duc finishing medieval cathedrals or Carcassonne with this idea of let's rebuild the past. And then in the 20th century, you had people like Aris Liga who said, well, this is a forgery. We should not, if something got destroyed even by a war, that's life. So we just keep it like that. So the Poles, the team that led the reconstruction was determined to remove that. But that was an exception. So there was criticism at the time, but it's important because it has an implication again of the Polish resilience against the Nazis. It is quite an important statement. However, today, preservation is a bit different. So also in the ICOMOS, for instance, I've been working with them the last 10 years on, there's a new charter of reconstruction that's going to come out in which, in a case of a traumatic event, be it war, earthquake, fire, so okay, they're traumatic in different ways, sites will actually be encouraged to rebuild, which is a break in the way that reconstruction has been seen for so long. So professionally, because many people can wonder today, many urban residents can say, why did the planners and architects rebuild so differently after the Second World War? That's because that was a dominant paradigm. But now we're seeing a different thing, and also this idea of you said reconstruction as maintenance, which can be seen at a short level of time. But what do we make of reconstruction in Germany happening now? Basically, Frankfurt or Berliner Schloss, or all these things that are happening, which are a form of nostalgia, somehow hijacked by different discourses from different political parties. So it's interesting. Is it just that people want a human scale city and they want to have a walk and see small little houses, or does it mean more about also removing that modernist 1950s and 60s? What does that mean? So there are a lot of questions. Sorry, yeah. I think I saw Hannah wanting to say something.
Yeah, thank you, Gruia. Very interesting talk. A lot of striking ideas and insights for me. And I wanted to proceed this theme with the way of reconstruction. I'm from Kharkiv. We have, our city wasn't occupied, but we have a lot of dwellings, destructions. So for example, my university, Kharkiv National University, named by Karazin, we have about 10 objects, and all of them are destroyed in different way. But some of them could be, I think, rebuilt in more modern way, because they were old, they were from Soviet period, and they have no value as some architect masterpieces. Yeah, but for example, our government buildings, City Hall and Region City Hall, we have a few projects now, and people trying to choose the best one. And for me, yes, I feel this idea that I would like to come back to my city, to the space we had before the war, and some new modern projects, on my opinion, won't give us this feeling. Yeah, because it's central buildings. And also I have a question for you. We have a very big district. We had it before the war. It calls Saltivka. There were only multi-store buildings, living buildings, and there lived 400,000 of people before the war. And all of these buildings, all of these houses are destroyed in different way. And people from Saltivka, they all want to come back to Saltivka. And what can we do with this district after the war? To rebuild it, or to build some new district in some other place? What is better? Because I know that cheaper would be to build another district in other place, yeah? But people want to come back to their houses, yeah? What?
Yeah, that's the key. What you just said here. I mean, it's important to know what people want, because if they and there's actually quite a discussion in our region in Central Eastern Europe about how do we relate to this kind of this mass housing large neighborhoods that come from the socialist times. And in the 1990s, there was this idea that people actually, they don't they want to live in houses or in the old part of the city. In many countries, there was an idea. But then anthropologists, sociologists saw that in fact, people have an emotional attachment to these neighborhoods, even and to their public spaces, quite generous, to the sense of community that exists. So somehow now we're better equipped to understand that people don't want just to move away. Like, for instance, in East Germany, there were so many that were just destroyed. Or I mean, if you look at also the debates, the Khrushchevkas in Moscow, there are places in which things have been dismantled the last years. But the most important thing here is not to think in principle, oh, is it good or bad to keep it, but actually to understand what residents want. So that's why reconstruction has to really be doubled by also what Yaroslava was saying, the surveys and a deep sociological and anthropological engagement with people, and not just a planning for planning's sake. So that's either that there are people who want to return, or people who are now living in these cities that they come from elsewhere. The consultation is not just a buzzword, but it should be actually really implemented to understand, so that people don't regret things in the future, as many other reconstructions have seen.
May I just a couple of words here? Actually, Anna anticipated my question about Saltivka, for instance, because Saltivka was not microrayon, but not microrayon, but it was about like 300,000 people living there, and these housing were panel assembled housing, ready-made housing, and of very poor quality. And it was built at a time, and it was about to go apart. So architects had concerns about, so the time was coming to do something with Saltivka. And actually the war happened, and now what to do in this case. And I think it's important, of course, social engagement and like consultations with the community and all, but it's also a decision of the experts and architects as well. So they have to communicate or to find the solution that will be like that could go for everybody.
Yeah, but this communication is important, and I would say it's somehow, in many of the post-Soviet and post-socialist countries, our architects are trained still in this modernist paradigm. So
yeah,
and the modernist paradigm also means that they think, and I see this in Romania, I see this in Yugoslavia, other places in which people, in which planners and architects say, we are experts. Would you ask? Would you tell your doctor what you think, or would you trust your doctor? You should trust us. And that's this way of thinking actually has created a lot of trouble in the last decades, because it's important to think of the expert, but the expert has to be open for discussion. And my experience also working, as I worked for a few years in practice, and also around in Armenia and Moldova, and so in our region more broadly, a lot of architects don't want to listen, because they say, why would I have to speak to them? We are the experts.
Yeah,
so
as
communication is important.
Actually, yeah. So it should be a two-way street, of course, definitely.
Yeah, so when we are looking like a state, seen like a state, yes, high modernism, we want to rebuild it in some other space. So I wanted to ask if there is some experience what to do with such neighborhoods, which was already old, or I don't know, or not very high quality. So maybe there is some experience from other countries on some other conflicts, wars, and so on.
Yeah, definitely. So there are, I mean, in the way of engaging, you can have proposals from professionals that then go through different forms of like design charades, as they're called in urban design, and then you go through different process of consultation and you create something together. But I see that we have a number of hands, and sadly I have to leave at 5, so or 6 Kiev times or Ukraine time. So maybe we can collect. What do you think?
Tatiana, do you have a question? Tatiana.
Yes, hello. I would like to thank you a lot for this topic. It was a very interesting discussion, and you make me think a different way about the reconstruction process, to compare these processes in Ukraine and other countries, because it depends on the culture, traditions, and so on and so forth. But I would like to tell some words, and I have a question. First of all, I would like to talk about southern Ukraine, because it's also very, maybe not the most, but such cities as Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia are shelling almost every day. And for example, in Mykolaiv, there is about 65–70% of civil and industrial infrastructure are destroyed now. But still, there are a lot of people who are living now in Mykolaiv. And I would like to discuss about reconstruction process, every process, social, environmental, economic process has a side effect. And when we are talking about the reconstruction process, I would like to discuss, what do you think, what environmental side effects would be in this process? Because there are 2 rivers in Mykolaiv region. And when we are talking about something renewal or to build something new, we should take into account what side effects by nature and environmental process it will become. If this part of society will involve in this process, they should also to have opinion or maybe interviews or maybe something similar. Yes. Do you think the environmental side effects would have only the positive ways, or we have either pros or cons?
Could you just rephrase the last part? So basically, if the environment, you mean the, could you say it again?
Yes, I mean the environmental side effect of our reconstruction process, yes. Do we have only pros, or we also have cons?
Okay.
And what do you think about it?
Yes. Maybe we can get Martin's question, and then just for interest of time.
Sure. I'll try and be quick. So I had three questions, and I'll just phrase them quickly, and there's no need to respond now. So I guess I had one question about resilience, which is, are we talking about resilience or are we talking about defiance, right? And I think that that's not just a terminological kind of question. I think it goes to the kind of question about what people think that they're doing, right? Because often resilience is framed as not as bouncing back to the original position, but as kind of always moving forwards, right? So you lose your house, but you have a contingency to carry on with your life somewhere else, some other how, right? Whereas actually, I wonder whether in some sense, in all of the processes you're talking about, reconstructing the built environment is precisely a kind of act of defiance in the face of aggression, crimes, destruction, and so on and so forth. And so I wonder whether that might help us understand some of the kind of motivations for reconstruction. I think the second question I had was, this isn't a criticism, but I just wondered whether you had something to say about infrastructure, because often it gets left out of the picture, right? It's just the banal. And actually, this comes back to kind of Francesca's kind of point about maintenance, right? That's just stuff that will work. It will plug the city back in, but it's not really that simple, right? Because, as we know, the putting in sewers and high-speed internet lines and all of these kinds of things, those are kind of major sort of building projects. They're not just we just plug something new back into a hole that was already there. So And I wonder how do we engage in that kind of planning process for infrastructures, right? Because it's all invisible, and well, if it's done properly, it's invisible, and it's very kind of technical. So it's hard to engage populations. They just want the internet to work, right? Or they want the tap to work, or the, you know, and so on. So so I wonder what you have to say about, you know, infrastructure in this process. And then I guess the third quick thing, and look, I know you can't answer this, but I was really fascinated with this kind of question about emplacement, right? Because, you know, dealing with kind of Anna's kind of question about, you know, what it means to feel at home somewhere, which is something you build up over long periods of time. And of course, you don't know anything else, right? Because you've lived somewhere, your social relations are all embedded in that place, and you know, and presumably the role of the planner, you know, we tend to cast the planner as this kind of expert and see the negative part of that, but presumably actually the role of the planner is to have people imagine things otherwise, right? So to say to them, look, you know, this is what you've built up over time, but it could be different, right? I mean, that would be a benign or benevolent way of thinking about the role that a planner could play in the process of emplacement, trying to you know, think through this kind of, you know, your social relations could be otherwise, than because otherwise we're always going to default back to things that have been built up over very, very long periods of time, and that's just natural, right? Anyway, look, I think those are big questions. I know you have to go, so but I wanted to offer them.
Oh, great question. So maybe I'll just quickly I'll start with the infrastructure. So basically, there is somehow a form of hierarchy of needs, like in you know, people talk about Maslow, the Maslow thing for how human needs, but in this case, the reconstruction needs, and you can see that many experts who work on reconstruction talk about this particular order. So I didn't talk because today was the direction was different, but there's a large body of work on this particular functional infrastructural reconstruction, and in which infrastructure is one of the key aspects to consider, housing and infrastructure at the beginning. Somehow, on the other hand, this issue of healing has to come parallel to that. It's a bit a parallel process, and has many actors. And in resilience and defiance, that's a very important point that you made. And actually, I would say that, for instance, defiance is what Warsaw did at the end of the war. That's an act of defiance. But what happens in Beirut after the explosion, or even during the war, or what happens in Homs, it's an act of resilience. More than the defiance, depending again who reads what, because also the government, for instance, when it's an opposition quarter in Aleppo, they could see it as an act of defiance, but the intentionality many times is just to repair and to move on. So but it's a very powerful duo, let's say, resilience and defiance. As for emplacement, that it's a long conversation with the environmental aspect. Of course, this is something that has to be taken into consideration now more than ever, because speaking of reconstruction as an opportunity, maybe the opportunity now is to thought what kinds of infrastructure, what kinds of energy, what kinds of way of rebuilding can we make in a city like Mykolaiv, where 65%, as you mentioned, infrastructure was affected, so that actually it's also a form of transition to a environment, to a different model. And I will say that, for instance, the Marshall Plan in Germany was used quite a lot for infrastructural improvement back in the day, while, for instance, Britain didn't do that. So that's why separate water taps, etc. No, but it's an opportunity now, actually, to think of an environmentally sound form of reconstruction, because otherwise, so maybe in this idea of repairing things from the past, in this case, can also be about environmental issues, because otherwise, the example of informality and cities expanding like crazy because of post-reconstruction is an example of badly environmental impact on the territory. So basically, we can continue the conversation, and I'm sorry that I have to leave now. And thank you so much for the energy and for all the questions and for being here. And I hope we can continue the conversation in the weeks to come. And feel free to write, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you a
Sure.
lot,
Thank
Gruia.
you so much. Thank you so much, Maryana.
Yeah,
You as a host.
so now we can let Gruia go to another meeting. And once more, I would like to remind that this talk is recorded In a few days, we will share it on the NAMU YouTube page. The link you can find in the emails with all the links for the talks. And also, if you miss the previous talk, they also are saved on the YouTube. So feel free to watch them when you will have time for this. And thank you all for joining us today. I think it was another wonderful discussion from our talk series, and wish you a nice evening, and what is most important, a silent evening. So see you.